Section 2, Economies and Politics. With the exception of maize, and later bean agriculture, there was nothing dramatically new in the way that Eastern Woodlands people lived in the late first millennium AD. It was just that the diversity and the intensive scale of river floodplain cultures reached new heights. The Mississippian coalesced over much of the southeast during the 11th and 12th centuries, with an efflorescence in the Cahokia region in about AD 1050. So these Mississippian cultures developed in river valleys, large and small, often expanding up small tributaries of the major waterways. This restriction of Mississippian populations to floodplains was not only because of easily cultivatable alluvial soils. For thousands of years, river valley peoples had adapted to low-lying environments where locally concentrated aquatic, game, and vegetation resources were abundant. Fertile soils formed bands within these same valleys, providing additional diversity of food resources in traditional homelands. So a constant supply of waterborne nutrients helped these floodplain areas sustain a rich biomass of animals and plants, which resulted in high human population densities. The Mississippians who lived in these environments developed complex yet very flexible subsistence patterns, which involved exploiting fish, migratory waterfowl, terrestrial game like deer, raccoon, turkeys, for example, nuts, fruits, berries, and seed-bearing indigenous plants. They selectively exploited these optimum energy sources within the floodplain ecosystem and deliberately destroyed the natural vegetation on preferred soils so that they could grow maize, beans, squash, and some domesticated indigenous plants. Factors just as important for people maximizing their floodplain habitats were local topography, the amount of spring flooding and summer drain-off, and location relative to migratory waterfowl flyways. As a result, fish and waterfowl together may have contributed to at least half of the total protein intake of Mississippian populations living along the bottomlands of interior rivers. In places where oxbow lakes and abandoned channel meanders were plentiful. So add to this the effective cultivation of nutrient-rich soils fertilized by regular floods, and it's safe to claim that the Mississippians enjoyed a unique subsistence opportunity in the eastern woodlands. Maize cultivation began in the southwest before the first millennium BC. The maize pool in the southwest was highly diverse, and a small cob of 12 to 14 rows of hard flint maize, sometimes known as North American pop, was probably the first maize to spread across the southern plains and into the southeast, probably around 2,000 years ago or around the year zero. Another variety, the 8-rowed hardy maize de oco, later became a staple over much of the Midwest and eastern woodlands. So maize began to be intensively cultivated only after AD 700 or 750. So maize was adopted slowly, and its use increased very slowly over time. Beans were introduced into the eastern woodlands in about AD 1000 and were not commonly grown until the late Mississippian period, which was after AD 1300. Beans came to provide an important protein source for eastern woodland peoples, as they did elsewhere in the Americas. So, and as we know, squash was domesticated in the eastern woodlands roughly 3000 BC. So, begun initially to create more supplemental foods, this new agricultural complex of maize and later beans transformed the landscape in such ways that hunting and foraging started to provide much less food for energy expended than maize cultivation. So this is a really unusual change. Within a short time, an entirely new economic pattern came into being. It's difficult to know really how important hunting was in Mississippian life. Apart from waterfowl and fish in the favored areas, the game species from many sites, which included the familiar species like deer, would actually be preying regularly on the maize fields. And so farmers tried to scare them away. And they then were treating maize agriculture in a preferential way. Wild plant foods continued to be of vital importance to Mississippian communities, especially the rich nut harvests, which were in the fall. In bountiful years, actually, nuts could provide enough food to feed a much higher population density than actually lived in even the most favored locations. But nuts became less important over time. Although any such estimates are obviously little more than extrapolations from later recorded figures, scholars have estimated that Native American maize yields, without the use of plows, might have been around 10 bushels an acre, although some scholars estimate a higher figure. With the average plot size or garden size for people without plows was probably a 0.6 of an acre, which would have provided less than 20% of a family's annual caloric needs, I guess depending on the size of the family. And traditional foraging would then provide the remaining 80% of the calories. But when social or political mechanisms developed the stimulated intensification of maize growth and other forms of agriculture, the garden size might have reached up to 3.4 acres. So growing from 0.6 of an acre to 3.4 acres. And so note that 3 acres of cultivation could provide 100% of the food to feed a family, and people certainly did not stop their foraging activities. This intensification would have allowed the accumulation of quite large food surpluses that could be manipulated for political ends. Scholars have only recently realized how short-term climate change, especially serious droughts, played an important role in social and economic change. Scholars have combined tree ring analysis, or dendrochronology, with archaeology to reconstruct climate history in the Savannah River Basin, with an eye to reconstructing Mississippian food storage capabilities from roughly AD 1005 to 1600. The combination of simple storage models and tree ring data suggests that there were long periods of plentiful food supplies and also long periods of serious shortages, which had a profound effect on the rise and fall of individual chiefdoms. Maintaining a year's food reserve would have given a local population enough time to switch to other foods to minimize the impact of poor rains and lower than average harvests. But a prolonged drought would have caused major stress and economic and political disruption, bringing small chieftains into contact with much more powerful neighbors as they competed for scarce resources. However, political factors as well as environmental change played an important role in the constant ebb and flow of chieftains in the region and elsewhere. So, for example, in the Savannah River Valley, we have ample evidence of sporadic Mississippian occupation, but the valley was abandoned about a century before the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto and his conquistadors got lost in the tangled undergrowth of the valley. Bountiful yields in good years meant good living, but yields from both fields and nut trees varied dramatically from year to year. The bottomlands of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers flood regularly in the spring and can be subject to inundation as late as July. Major floods would have drowned crops, ruined pit-stored food, and interfered with fishing in the shallow ponds that would dry up later in the summer. The largest Mississippian sites in the American bottoms are all ones with a good mix of permanent bodies of water in abandoned river channels, high and low ridges, and regularly flooded low-lying areas. The floods were irregular but not infrequent, making farming on such lands a high-risk proposition, even today. So it was no coincidence that many Mississippian communities and their gardens concentrated on the fertile, well-drained ridges or in nearby terrace soils that were never flooded, even if the risk of drought was higher. Almost certainly, most villages maintained fields both in high-risk flood areas and also on higher ground, which were at risk for drought. So here other factors came into play. Crop diseases spread through closely placed gardens and the buildup of pests and weeds resulting from repeated cropping of the same land. This meant that most Mississippian communities lived with the constant threat of food shortages. People dwelt in permanent settlements, so they could not adopt the age-old strategy of shifting base when local resources were in short supply. So in some locations there may have occasionally been episodes of extreme stress, and a series of studies of some Mississippian burials reveal stress lines of limb bones, known as Harris lines, and other clear signs of cyclical stress on the skeletons, some of which were probably caused by dietary factors. So, what strategies then could prevent starvation in lean years? Most of the time, the household was a self sufficient entity, but at least once or twice a decade, the yields of gardens and trees was probably insufficient, creating a real need for vital supplemental food resources and for the social mechanisms to minimize the risk of famine. So each household may have cultivated a mosaic of several gardens situated in separate environmental zones. People short of food could rely on kinspeople living in other areas for seed and rations, knowing that one day they might have to reciprocate in kind. Another strategy would be that a community or kin group could stockpile surplus food from one year for use in lean times. So several of these strategies required some form of coordination, either through kin leaders or even on a larger scale. Some groups may even have gone so far as to maintain communal granaries under the control of a local chieftain. For example, in the 18th century, there was a botanist named William Bartram who wrote of the Muskegon people of the Southeast. Quote, "There is a large crib or granary erected in the plantation, which is called the King's Crib, and to this each family carries and deposits a certain quantity according to his ability or inclination. This granary acts as a public treasury to which every citizen has the right of free and equal access when his own private stores are consumed, to serve as a surplus, to fly for succor, to assist neighboring towns whose crops may have failed." End quote. According to Bartram, the chief was responsible for seeing to the needy. So using the technique of upstreaming, which I discussed earlier, we can imply this 18th century practice back 500 years or more onto southeastern agricultural communities. The emergence of an elite within Mississippian society may have been a way of mitigating risks for households and for entire villages. These leaders were the people who oversaw the stockpiling of food supplies, who ensured that the cultivated lands were maintained in different environmental zones so that the chances of crop failure were much reduced. Some of these strategies could be operated through ties of kin and reciprocity, but only up to a certain point of scale. At times, food shortages may have been such that entire regions had to cooperate with one another, cooperation that required organized leadership and coordination in a more formal way than families or neighbors could provide. At the center of these mechanisms of reciprocity and cooperation lay complex local and long-distance exchange systems, developed in various forms over many centuries. So Mississippian socio-political systems were based on households, which were the primary productive units. These households were grouped into larger communities, both mound centers and outlying settlements linked to them. These economically self-sufficient mound center dominated districts were tied, mainly through politics, to the largest of all of these communities, which was Cahokia and its immediate support area. Thus, even the largest of the Mississippian chieftains retained its segmental organization during its rise, apogee, and fall. This form of segmented organization, with a great deal of local variation, is typical of historically and ethnographically known societies in the region. So most Mississippian exchange took place at the household level, the domestic unit that organized and scheduled food gathering and production. Mississippian communities were also grouped into larger political and social units, headed by local kin leaders, individuals who probably rose to prominence, just as their predecessors had done for centuries. These leaders, whose survival depended on their ritual and political skills in societies riven by factionalism, perhaps functioned as a way of balancing the distribution of vital foods and raw materials. Many exotic objects are found in Mississippian burials, and so many archaeologists have tended to describe all such internments as high-status individuals. But this is a dangerous assumption. Most burial excavations have concentrated on centrally located, high-status cemeteries, often places where a much greater variety of artifacts would occur anyway. So were such exotic objects, like shell cups, engraved shells, and other fine artifacts, were they badges of rank, or merely trade objects that were widely distributed in societies that showed little social or material distinction between commoner and elite. At Cahokia, both in habitation and mortuary sites, the elite tended to have more money and better made objects than commoners, often of non-local and thus rare materials. But commoners seem to have goods too, less in number and locally made, but goods nonetheless. So the Mississippian exchange networks linked hundreds of communities, large and small, mainly with local transactions. Production of artifacts of every kind was a dispersed activity throughout the Mississippian territory. For instance, seashells were exchanged over vast areas of the Southeast. Complete shells would be turned into ornaments and then often engraved with distinctive designs by specialists. The motifs executed by different individuals can be recognized in many cases, and then these objects were in turn traded along and through the network. Another example of a good that was traded through the Mississippian exchange networks was chert, especially chert from the famous Union County quarries in Illinois. And these probably were quarried by local part-time specialists. Made with Union County chert, the famous Millcrete chert hose, like a garden hoe, was produced over a long period, starting roughly in AD 900, and then it was traded so widely a century later that they had become the single most common hoe form in the Mississippi Valley. So the chert was a hard, granular material that was ideal for moving and turning over heavy clay-rich soils in the river valleys. The chert itself was obtained through pit mining, and it was then turned into blanks and tools at nearby workshops. So Cahokia ended up being the major distribution center for the Mill Creek hose, and artifacts like these traveled long distances, even up to 500 miles from their source quarries. Another trade good that was traded throughout the Mississippian system was salt. So salt production assumed much greater importance as maize cultivation expanded in the Southeast. Farmers had to artificially supplement their diets with salt. So cake salt was manufactured only at a limited number of places. And according to an 18th century French explorer named Lepage du Prat, people would travel long distances to such locations to make salt. There may have been some centers of local production, but this would be at best a part-time activity involving work parties from various communities, probably at a distance. So it's just because the salt trade was not large enough to warrant full-time specialization. So as far as scholars can tell, person-to-person bartering or gift-giving and formal redistribution were the only means of exchanging goods and commodities in Mississippian society. This means that the highly diverse Mississippian communities were not organized along very formal, rigid social class lines, even if local politics played a vital role in day-to-day existence. The modes of production were little more complex than those found earlier in woodland societies, although the elite certainly supported men and women who produced prestige goods and ritual objects when needed. Mississippian communities were highly politicized, exchanging and producing goods and commodities through ties of kin and reciprocal obligations. Judging from historical accounts, the more elite members of society may have been involved in the storage and redistribution of grain. So apparently these stockpiles could reach impressive proportions. We know this because in later centuries, European explorers like the Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto looted considerable quantities of stored grain from the southeastern villages. Much of the grain redistribution activity may have taken place at formal ceremonies. In the 17th century, southeastern communities from many miles around would congregate at feasts and dances, at which people would barter goods, share food, and reaffirm ties with villages and individuals. So indigenous people in the region actually today still congregate for these ceremonial gatherings.